Thank you. I here am the Matroszek Fellow at Pusey House in St. Cross College, and Mr. Matroszek, who has a Polish surname, but actually isn't a Polish citizen. He's a British citizen, and was the first in his family to end up at university, ended up at Magdalen College, which you all probably know, and it was also where C.S. Lewis famously was taught for many years. And he loved his alma mater, and he still goes there regularly, but he found that the kinds of things he wanted to do in the modern university were less commonly done at his, or through his alma mater, or through some of the other institutions of the university. Not done, but less commonly done. And he thought that they could reliably be done at a place like Pusey House, which has a real relation and affiliation with the university through myself, Father George, and Father Mark, who are the Pusey Fellows of St. Cross College, but also has independence, doesn't receive money from the Church of England or from the university. And so we're able to do things that are harder to be done now in other places that are downstream from direct public funding or from donors big donors that ask for a lot. Now, Mr. Matroszek is a big donor for us, but he doesn't ask for much besides two things. He wanted us to defend against some of the ideas in the public space that are a threat to the integrity of the human person, especially in reference to that as part of the doctrine of the Incarnation, and also to provide the best arguments we could for a robust philosophical anthropology. And with those two things in mind, we've used the money he's given to do events like this and to partner with institutions that are willing to come with us on one or the other of those goals. And in this case, it's the latter of those goals. It's the question of philosophical anthropology, perhaps theological anthropology, giving a real defense for the human person, for the reality of that person, and in this case, for the kind of knowledge, moral and otherwise, that that person might have in the space where he finds himself. We have two, as far as I could tell, they do differ on a number of things, but we hadn't yet puzzled out precisely what those were in the preliminary discussions before, but we have two defenders of the Thomistic legacy of natural law, one in what I understand to be perhaps a more classically modern Thomistic register, and the other in what's sometimes called, although not by John Finnis, the New Natural Law register. So without further ado, I'll simply say there will be 30 minutes from Professor Koons, then immediately 30 minutes from Professor Moschella. Then there will be 5-minute rebuttal, 5-minute rebuttal, 3-minute closing, 3-minute closing. Whatever time is left before half past the next hour, I'll let you do the maths, will be used for questions and answer in response to that. This is live streamed and is recorded, so you can return to it on the Pusey House website or perhaps on the website of the Civitas Institute of the University of Texas at Austin. So without any more said, let me turn this over to you, Professor Koons, for the opening statement of the Thomistic Natural Lawyers in a Modern Register.
Right. Great, thank you, John. Thank you, William. Thanks for the organizers. It's great honor and privilege to be here. Thanks to Melissa for our conversation that we'll have. Let's see. I'm going to defend, as Jonathan suggested, a traditional Thomistic Aristotelian position on the relationship between natural law and human nature, in opposition to the new natural law of Finnis, Grisey, and Boyle, which Melissa will be the spokesperson tonight. The natural law tradition, as you know, is rooted in the work of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, and others, and it's played a central role in the history of Western civilization, in particular in our conceptions of ethics, law, and politics. And it's played that role, I think, because it is simply both profound and correct. So the task of interpreting and defending that tradition is terribly important. In our contemporary setting, there are two competing conceptions of that tradition: the Aristotelian Thomistic traditional program, and the New Natural Law. The creators of the New Natural Law paradigm deserve a lot of credit, I think, for rehabilitating the very concept of natural law in the academy in the 1960s and 70s. But in doing so, I think that they compromised with modern philosophy, especially that of Descartes, Hume, and Kant, at certain critical points. And they also, these compromises, along with certain idiosyncratic elements that were introduced at the beginning, render the new natural law paradigm, I think, an indefensible position in the end. And so if these errors are not corrected, the contemporary revival of natural law is in danger of collapse. So the discussion matters, I think. There are 6 issues in contention tonight, I think, which are all tightly connected, as we'll see. I'm going to put them in terms of 6 propositions of the new natural law, with which I disagree. The first one, the new natural law is committed to what I would call a short list of basic human goods, roughly 7 in number, as you can see in the handout: life, knowledge and appreciation, and so on. By basic human goods, we mean things that are objectively good and worthy of choice for every human being, independent of whether that human being actually desires or prefers them. A basic good is one that's valuable for its own sake, not merely instrumentally. And by calling them human goods, we mean that they're things at which human beings can aim and realize through their actions. So in that sense, preserving another species or even a whole ecosystem could count as a human good. Now, I would defend that there are basic goods, but I would defend a longer list than the 7 allowed by the new natural law, including such things as justice, responsibility in work, truthfulness in speech, participation in traditions, other virtues. But this is obviously not a fundamental question. As we'll see, I think, the shortness of the NNL list is a result of other commitments. The sparse list of the NNL would force us to treat all of our legal and political practices in particular as merely instrumentally good, which in turn means a possible undermining of civic loyalty and constitutional preservation. Secondly, the NNL is committed to a strict, exceptionalist deontological rule, which I'll call the no sacrifice rule, or I think Melissa prefers calling it the no intended harm rule. Namely, that it's never morally permissible to deprive intentionally anyone of any basic good. This applies both to depriving others of a basic good and to depriving oneself of one. And this rule holds no matter how much of a gain in other basic goods has to be foregone in order to conform to this extremely strict rule. I'm going to disagree with that. Thirdly, the new natural law is committed to what I would call a very strong doctrine of incommensurability of the basic goods, meaning that the reason never gives us a ground for preferring one basic good at the expense of another, at least in terms of its intrinsic value. Now, I'm going to offer a distinction between strong and weak doctrine of incommensurability, and I will concede for the sake of the discussion a weak version, but not the strong version of incommensurability. Fourthly, and most fundamentally, the new natural law is committed to a strict separation of practical and theoretical knowledge. According to the new natural law, all our practical knowledge is grounded by our grasping from an irreducibly first-person agentive perspective certain principles, first principles of action, including the 7 basic goods. Now, I will argue that these 2 modes of knowledge, practical and theoretical, should be distinguished but not separated. That is, we agree, Melissa and I agree, that human beings are not should be distinguished, but not in particular. Theoretical knowledge about the teleology of human nature can contribute to our practical knowledge of the human goods. The 5th point is somewhat more elusive, but I think that the defenders of the new natural law are all committed to a semantic and metaphysical distinction between practical and theoretical truths and facts. So not only are practical and theoretical modes of knowledge separate and not combinable, but their objects, according to new natural law, form disjoint domains of fact. So if I know something practically, I cannot know the same thing theoretically, and of course vice versa. I'll contend, in contrast, that the 2 domains are actually the same. So whatever you could know theoretically, you could know practically, and perhaps vice versa. Sixthly, in order to make the no sacrifice or no harm rule plausible, new natural law theorists develop a very narrow conception of what an agent does intentionally. I'll call this the mental blackboard model. In contrast, I'll defend a much broader conception, the power activation model. Now, of course, there's a great deal about which Melissa and I agree. That's already clear from my statement of the disagreements. We agree that human beings are hylomorphic compounds of soul and body. That is, we agree that we human beings are not wholly immaterial beings that merely interact with the body. Instead, the human soul is the form by which the body is a living thing. This soul or form imposes a nature upon the resulting human being, human nature, something metaphysically fundamental that's common to all human beings. We agree in the distinction between practical and theoretical knowledge. And we agree that there are first principles of practical knowledge, principles that necessarily play the primary role in grounding all of our practical knowledge. We agree that there are basic human goods, indeed that there's an irreducible plurality of such goods. We agree in not trying to reduce human happiness to a single good, even to the intellectual apprehension of God in the beatific vision. In addition, the new natural lawyers and I agree that there's such a thing as natural teleology. By natural teleology, I just mean a teleology that isn't the product of human intention. As I survey the new natural law literature, I think that teleology of this kind, natural teleology, plays an essential role in at least 5 places. First, new natural lawyers and I agree that zygotes are human persons. And because zygotes are naturally ordered to the end of developing into adult human beings, endowed with reason. Zygotes share the same form, the same kind as that of other human beings, a form that's responsible for endowing the zygote with an intrinsic potentiality for intellectual understanding and free will. Secondly, the basic good of marriage involves a reference to the natural functioning of the reproductive organs. The marital act is by definition an act naturally ordered to human reproduction, an act in which the male and female genitalia combine to act as a teleologically ordered whole. Third, as a consequence of the second point, new natural lawyers agree there's a binary distinction between human males and females, and I agree as well. Any such distinction must make reference to a teleological difference between the two, since there are no morphological or genetic markers that perfectly track the distinction. Fourth, the basic good of life and bodily integrity, or health, is essentially teleological in character. One is healthy when one's organs and tissues perform their natural function in relationship to each other. Fifth, and most importantly, the very idea of basic human goods implies a kind of teleology of the human will. The human will is a faculty that is supposed to choose what is good as such. Something has gone wrong if it does not do so. And this is true even if the will is maximizing its desires, preferences, and prior commitments of the person in question. Whether we like it or not, our wills are naturally ordered to the end of choosing well, and that's a kind of final causation or teleology. So given that both new natural lawyers and traditional Aristotelians are committed to natural theology, this fact raises a host of interesting problems, both in metaphysics and philosophy of nature. Now, when Grisephinus and Boyle began developing the new natural law in the 60s, natural teleology was under something of a cloud of suspicion. Many philosophers following Carl Hempel and others took teleology in nature to be scientifically obsolete. This has changed dramatically in the last 60 years, to the point that belief in natural teleology is now a perfectly respectable position, even among philosophers of a naturalistic bent. Now, I take it that new natural lawyers will welcome this kind of work, the kind of work that William Simpson, I, and others at this conference have been engaged in over the last 15 years, arguing that we can find a place for teleology through a neo-Aristotelian philosophy of nature. I recommended our edited volume, Neo-Aristotelian Perspectives on Contemporary Science, William's Hylomorphism volume, and the Cambridge Elements sequence, and my own book on Aquinas' Philosophy of Nature, which we have available in the library later. The alternatives to this neo-Aristotelian project should be unattractive to anyone favorably disposed to the work of Thomas Aquinas, whether it's reductionism, dualism, or idealism. A neo-Aristotelian approach embraces exactly the kind of ontological and causal pluralism that's needed to give human agency its proper place in the world, without falling into a kind of immaterialism or dualism about the human person that both new natural lawyers and I would reject. It's because we're essentially embodied agents that we're also essentially social and historical animals. Now, we in this neo-Aristotelian movement have recently argued that the quantum revolution in physics, in particular, creates the opportunity for providing an adequate account of the place of human beings in nature. This is not primarily because of the indeterminism of the theory, because of two additional features of the new physics. Its holism and its resurrection of the Aristotelian distinction between actuality and potentiality. The resurrection of potentiality, or powers, in the philosophy of nature has been a remarkable feature of much contemporary analytic philosophy. To be of use in a theory of human agency, we need to recognize the existence of fundamental, irreducible causal powers at the level of biology and human psychology. The hylomorphism of the Aristotelian tradition that I mentioned earlier is crucial here. It allows for composite, middle-sized objects, like human beings and other organisms, to be unified and animated by a form that acts upon the matter, conferring a variety of causal powers and potentialities to the resulting entity. Now, I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so in what might seem a digression into Aristotelian metaphysics, in particular the metaphysics of powers and potentialities. So I want to ask your indulgence. I want to show that the details of an Aristotelian account of nature is going to be critical to the right interpretation of natural law and ethics. So here's an important fact. Once we have causal powers in our ontology, one also has teleology. The causal powers a thing has are determined by its nature and by its accidents. Each causal power is essentially forward-looking. It refers to a possible but not yet actual result, a result that would occur if and when the causal power manifests itself. So, for example, every negatively charged particle has the power to repel other negatively charged particles. A particular electron has this power even if it never encounters any other negatively charged particles, and so never exercises the power. Causal powers are naturally ordered towards a possible future state, their manifestation. Thus, causal powers have what George Molnar has called proto-intentionality, or physical intentionality. Just as the intentional state of a mind, like an opinion or a desire, can be directed to an object that doesn't exist, so too can a causal power of a physical object be naturally directed to a possible manifestation that's never actualized. A bit of fire may never have the opportunity to heat anything, and yet it retains the power of heating. So for Aquinas, final causation, causation in terms of ends, is merely another way of describing the same phenomenon as efficient causation, causation in terms of intrinsic causal powers. Thomas asserts that every agent must act for an end, therefore claiming that every instance of efficient causation is ipso facto also an instance of final causation, acting for an end. His reason for this claim is very simple. Quote, "For if an agent were not oriented to some effect, it would not do this more than that." That's in the first part of the second part, question 1. In other words, the fact that the active causal power of an agent is directed to some specific form of manifestation, as the power of heating is directed towards the manifestation of heating things, this suffices for the agent to be acting for an end. The end of the action is simply the characteristic form of manifestation of the agent's powers. Therefore, to be a realist about causal powers is automatically to be a realist about final causation. So, if there are irreducibly human causal powers, that brings with them an irreducibly human teleology. And if there's an irreducibly human form of teleology, we can sensibly ask whether the human being has, as a whole, a single end, a telos, or final causes. If human beings do have a telos, discovering what that telos or end is would be of great importance to our practical knowledge, as Aristotle argued in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. You have the quotation, I think, on the handout. In Summa Theologia 1:2, question 1, article 5, and in his commentary on the metaphysics, Thomas Aquinas identifies both the final cause of a human being and human happiness, our chief good, with our self-perfection as a substance, which is further identified with the actualization of certain of our natural powers or potentialities. Now, doesn't this implicate the Aristotelian Thomist in what G.E. Moore called the naturalistic fallacy? Doesn't it involve an invalid inference from what is the final cause of human nature to what ought to be the good of human happiness? From a proper Aristotelian perspective, there is no such fallacy and there is no such gap. The plausibility of Hume's theory of the is-ought gap depends on our failing to distinguish between what a particular human being takes as good on a particular occasion and what human nature directs that human being to value, which is the final cause of the human being. The mere fact that someone happens to want or desire something does not make it good, but if the pursuit of something is essential to being human, then that is precisely what being a human good means. In Aristotle's system, there are 3 kinds of powers or potentialities: active, passive, and immanent. An active causal power is a power to cause a change in something else, the patient. Passive causal power is the potentiality to be changed in a certain way by an agent. An immanent causal power is the power to engage in a certain kind of activity, one that stays within the agent, as in the case of activities like imagination or contemplation. Immanent powers are unconditional in the way that the other 2 are not. An immanent power manifests itself in a substance whenever the substance is in a normal condition and in a normal environment and no obstacle intrudes. An active power can be exercised only when the appropriate kind of patient is present, and a passive power is manifested only when the corresponding active power is exercised. So when we speak of the telos, or natural end of a substance like human being, we are primarily referring to the exercise of immanent powers. Now, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas both identify human happiness, eudaimonia or beatitudo, with the actualization of our immanent causal powers, in particular, our potentiality for the activity of intellectual contemplation. However, this strikes me, and also new natural lawyers, as somewhat too narrow. Contrary to the views of Aristotle and Thomas, there are some active and passive powers that also seem to be implicated in human happiness. For example, sense perception is a passive power, the potentiality to be affected by objects in our environment. And surely being able to perceive things is partly constitutive of human happiness. The activities of friendship and political participation involve both active and passive powers, as well as immanent potentialities. So perhaps we should give a certain priority or centrality to the actualizing of immanent powers without completely excluding active and passive ones. Now, there's a second distinction which cuts across the first one. A human being has causal powers at least 4 different levels: a physical chemical level, a vegetable or merely organic level, a sentient animal level, and a rational or political level. In identifying the human telos, we can immediately set aside those causal powers that are merely physical or chemical in nature. We want to know what the end of a human being is, and that means the end of a human being as a whole, as such. Our physical and chemical powers are possessed by our material parts or by the whole body merely as an aggregate of those parts and not as a single entity. My body has the physical potential to break a glass window when thrown at it, and a potential to generate a certain quantity of ashes if incinerated. But clearly, the actualizing of those powers is irrelevant to my happiness. Physical and chemical powers of the body are relevant only to the extent they undergird physical, biological, and personal powers. Now, in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Aristotle seems to limit happiness to the exercise of our rational powers and those powers that presuppose rationality, since these are the only powers that are shared only by human beings, not found among non-human organisms. Once again, this restriction seems unwarranted. Why should human happiness involve only those powers that are unique to human beings? Why shouldn't the actualization of some of our merely organic or merely sensate and animate powers not be included? Surely health and the exercise of our five senses contributes constitutively to our happiness. I want to make a third distinction among causal powers. That's between essential powers and accidental ones. By essential powers, I mean those powers that are constitutive of or flow necessarily from our essence as a human being. I'm including those powers that scholastic philosophers would have called propria, or proper accidents, as well. Powers that are not strictly part of our essence, but which are consequential to it. By accidental powers, here I mean those that bear only a contingent relationship to our essence. So I classify our power of speech, our potential for musicality, our capacity for humor as essential powers, but my power to speak English or Spanish are only contingent powers. The human essence does not entail speaking one language or another. Now, the distinction between essential and accidental powers is not equivalent to the distinction between innate and acquired powers. Infants are not born with the capacity to speak. This power must be developed over time, but nevertheless, it is an essential power. So clearly, human happiness demands only that we actualize some essential powers, not our accidental ones. And then I want to make a final distinction among our powers, that between conditional and unconditional powers. I have the passive power to perceive a green pentagram when one is in my environment. However, I'd be perfectly happy without ever exercising that particular power, as long as I never encounter a green pentagram. There's nothing abnormal or life-denying about a green pentagram-free environment. In contrast, the exercise of my general power of sight is partly constitutive of my happiness. The general power of seeing is relatively unconditional when compared to the power of seeing a green pentagram. Similarly, my body has the power to fight infection through its immune system, but one can be perfectly happy without exercising that power, so long as one does not encounter the infectious pathogens. But of course, none of our powers are absolutely unconditional. They're all conditional on two things: on our internal constitution being in a healthy state, and our being located in a normal environment, in an environment that's normal for human beings. So how can I define or even discern what is normal in these two ways? Do we have to rely on some kind of brute intuition or a normative kind? Does normal simply mean common or typical or desirable? I don't think so. I think we can define normality scientifically in a way that does not rely on mere frequency or desirability. And in making this claim, I'll rely on Bishop Joseph Butler's 15 sermons preached at Rolls Chapel in 1729, specifically on sermons 2 and 3. In those sermons, Butler focuses on the way in which our various desires, drives, and impulses form a coherent system, which he calls the constitution of human nature. Butler distinguishes between our fallen nature and what he calls our real and proper nature. And I think I've got some quotes from Butler in the handouts, which I won't read for reasons of time. In explaining the contrasting notion of our real and proper nature, he considers the example of a man who succumbs to a snare or a trap, being aware that he does so being aware that by doing so, he's rushing into the danger of certain ruin, merely for the sake of a momentary gratification of desires. Butler describes such a rash action as unnatural, as disproportionate to human nature. But what can this difference between these impulses consist in? Butler argues that some impulses must be superior in authority over others, even when they are inferior in strength. Right? So all of this is no more than the distinction, this is Butler, which everyone is acquainted with, between mere power and authority. Only instead of being intended to express the difference between what is possible and what is lawful in a civil government, here it has been shown to be applicable to the several principles in the mind of man. So the analogy is the mind of man forms a kind of civic constitution. And we can use the systematic character of that constitution to distinguish those impulses that have authority over others. The Butlerian idea of a human constitution can be applied not just to our appetites and desires, but to all the powers and potentialities that pertain to our nature. And Butler himself suggests just as much. He talks about how our body is a system of this kind, and so is the whole human being. These mutual proportions and respects that Butler refers to echo an earlier idea expressed by Plato in the Republic, the idea that the good life is one characterized by internal coherency and harmony. Both Plato and Butler are relying on an analogy between the final cause of the whole person and health is the final cause of the functioning of the body, of the body's organs. The various organs are interdependent. We could say that the health of the heart and the health of the kidneys are incommensurable. One cannot rank one as intrinsically more important than the other, but they're not independent. The heart cannot function well without the kidneys doing so, and vice versa. Discern the proper function of the organs scientifically by discovering these interdependencies. Just as happiness corresponds to health, so unhappiness to illness. In Republic Book 1, Plato describes the unjust or immoral person in terms of an internal division and conflict. And injustice will produce its natural effects also in the individual. It renders him incapable of action because of internal conflicts and divisions of purpose, and sets him at variance with himself and with all who are just. In Book 4, Plato defends the idea that only the just and moral person is happy in terms of the same sort of internal happiness, internal harmony. So the notion of a natural harmony or constitution among our powers can best be understood dynamically over the long run. Powers form a harmonious system or constitution when they are mutually supportive over time. And we can extend this constitution into our environment, including the external powers that help sustain this harmonious internal system. It's this harmonious constitution that gives some of our faculties and powers authority over others. Butler identifies two such authoritative faculties, rational self-love and the conscience. These faculties have authority over our other particular passions, to use Butler's language, including our love for the other various basic goods. Consequently, it can be rational to deny ourselves or others one or more of the basic goods for the sake of the long-term health of the human constitution. In particular, the long-run health of our human constitution requires that the good of religion, which Butler calls the conscience, must play a overriding role in our decision-making. Not that religion is the only basic good, but that we cannot enjoy any of the other basic goods in the long run unless our attachment to it is recognized as supreme and overarching. Now, to clarify what I mean, I'll try to make one more point about the nature of causal powers. Powers can be obstructed, disabled, and even destroyed. If my eyes are shut or I'm located in a totally dark room, my power of sight is obstructed and disabled. If my eyes are blinded, that power is destroyed. Nonetheless, sight remains one of my essential powers as a human being. So if some causal power is not obstructed, disabled, or destroyed, we can say that the person is well disposed with respect to that power, or the power itself is in a good disposition. And so now we're in a position to define the constitution of a human being in this Butlerian way. It's this largest set of causal powers, A plus C plus E, where set A includes all the immanent powers, these are unconditional. The set C contains only the essential active and passive causal powers of the human being at this organic or rational level. The set E contains powers of objects in the environment, which can be expected to occur in the surroundings of the human being with a non-negligible frequency. And then the successful actualization of each member of C plus E contributes causally in the long run, and is in the long run a causally necessary condition for the proper disposition of some of the other members of A plus C. So there's a harmony here that can be used to distinguish between normal condition. So we can say that human beings in a normal condition if all the internal powers of the human being, human constitution are well disposed in that human being. And we can say that the environment is normal when the external powers are well disposed and the environment does not contain any powers whose exercise would obstruct, disable, or destroy any of the internal powers of the constitution. So the happiness or chief good of a human being then consists in the actualization over the long run of the human constitution. Some of the powers that make up the human constitution are higher order powers. These include the power of practical reason, whose excellence is the virtue of prudence. So I've completed my account of Aristotelian philosophy of nature, so now we can return to the debate with the new natural law in the last few remaining minutes. If all this is correct, then we can see that the human good is something that belongs, both semantically and metaphysically, to the domain of the objects of theoretical knowledge, in contradiction to Proposition 5. It's possible for a non-human, like God or an angel, to cognize and even to know the human good from a purely third-person scientific perspective by simply investigating the human essence and its causal powers, the interdependency of the components of the human constitution. But can we human beings know the human good in this way? Or must we know it exclusively in a first-person practical mode of knowledge, as Proposition 4 claims? I certainly don't deny that we have such a distinctively practical way of knowing the human good. And I would agree that practical knowledge is our primary mode of access to these basic goods. We have an inside information as human beings. Now, in Nicomachean Ethics Book 1, Aristotle really agrees. He asserts that being well brought up and having extensive experience are necessary conditions for grasping the principles of ethics. This age-ended perspective is required for complete practical knowledge of goods. But it's not innate. It must be developed over time. It requires at least a rudimentary training in self-control and a kind of proto-virtue in the knower. All the theoretical knowledge in the world will do the human person no good, no practical good, without a substantial foundation of this practical knowledge. However, none of this entails that the theoretical knowledge of the good can make no contribution to our practical knowledge. I can see at least 3 ways in which theoretical knowledge can contribute to our practical knowledge. First, as a corrective. Our practical apprehension of the good is not infallible. We can practically believe in a false value. For example, many people have believed that managing slaves is a basic human good. Theoretical knowledge of human nature can defeat such practical errors. Second, as a supplement. We can fail to apprehend genuine human good in a practical way. For example, C.S. Lewis admitted in Mere Christianity that he lacked the practical knowledge of the value of loving and enjoying children. And his theoretical knowledge of human nature enabled him to recognize this lacuna in his practical makeup. Finally, theoretical knowledge can be an aid to growth in practical knowledge. To acquire practical knowledge, we must acquire virtue. And acquiring virtue requires that we act consistently in a way that imitates and emulates virtuous actions. In doing so, we can rely on theoretical knowledge of the good, including knowledge gained by testimony. For example, Lewis might have gained some practical knowledge of the value of children by imitating the actions of those with the appropriate practical knowledge. So let me now turn to Proposition 3, the incommensurability of basic goods. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'll distinguish between weak and strong incommensurability. Weak incommensurability refers to the incommensurability of different goods in the short term, in a single moment. Strong incommensurability would entail there's no rational grounds for sacrificing one good for another, even when the long-term perspective is taken into account. So I'm going to grant the weak form, but challenge the strong form here. Now, new natural lawyers argue for incommensurability on the grounds that note that the 2 distinct basic goods have no common denominator, like quantity or pleasure, that would rationally ground a preference for one over the other. But my definition of the Constitution assumed that acquiring goods can affect one's acquisition of other goods in the future by protecting and sustaining some of one's essential causal powers. So it seems plausible to suppose that acquiring a balanced set of goods in the short run would be a necessary condition for attaining any basic goods in the long run. If I pursue goods in a highly unbalanced, completely neglecting some basic goods in a single-minded pursuit of others, this will cause a deterioration of my character, resulting ultimately in a loss of my capacity to attain any basic goods. So I've got a little graph here that shows a short-term kind of trade-off between 2 goods like play and friendship, where any kind of short-term sacrifice of one will lead to a gain in the other and vice versa, versus a long-term kind of trade-off, right, where we see that if we are unbalanced, we lose the capacity to gain both goods, right? So the Pareto-optimal frontier lies just within 2 rays there that represent the proper kind of balance between the 2 goods. So there is a kind of trade-off that can be justified. So if Proposition 3 goes, so goes Proposition 2. The new natural argument for Proposition 2 depends on the irrationality of sacrificing one basic good for another, which is supposed to make it irrational to intentionally deprive anyone of any basic good. But in fact, it's rational to deprive oneself of basic goods from the point of view of the long-term good of one's constitution, and also deprive others of goods. So it can be both rational and actually morally permissible to act in a way that's harmful with respect to one of these goods. Now, does this mean that we're left with no exceptionalist deontological rules? I don't think so. We can see that certain deontological constraints are necessary for sustaining our human constitution. Sustaining a good character requires that we find certain choices literally unthinkable, like murdering an innocent person or committing adultery, as Aristotle puts it. So there's more to discerning the natural law than simply to recognize a list of basic human goods. We have to understand how human society functions in order to discern the lineaments of the human constitution there, in the social realm. We have to discover the role that the positive law plays in regulating human behavior. But dropping to Proposition 2 also undermines Proposition 1, the short list of human goods. The new natural lawyers are forced by Proposition 2 to keep the list of basic goods very short because if we include too many things, it's implausible to think that it's always wrong to deprive anybody of this very long list of basic goods. But since we've given up, if we give up Proposition 3, we no longer have to limit ourselves to such a short list. And that brings me finally to Proposition 6. Am I doing time-wise? Am I out over time already? 30 seconds? Okay, so, right. So perhaps we'll get into this discussion, but I think Proposition 6, the mental blackboard model, is also driven by Proposition 2, by the very strict kind of no harm rule, right? And it's frankly an implausible principle. So the alternative view that Aquinas provides us with is that human beings act by virtue of using powers. So this is in question 16 of part 1-2. So the human being has various powers, like I have the power to move my limbs, right? And action occurs when the will uses some other power, right? Whereas the mental blackboard picture suggests that our will simply issues little imperatives in the head. Let my hand rise. And that's just not the way human beings work, right? It may be the way God works. Let there be light and there was light. But let my hand move, nothing happens. I actually have to use the causal power that's involved. And once you realize that, you realize that the causal power that's used by the will then is definitive of the kind of action that is being chosen. Right? So if I use a power which is inherently lethal, essentially lethal, then I am intending to kill, in those circumstances, whatever's going on inside my little mental blackboard. All right, I'll quit there and move on to give a chance. All right, thanks.
Put water on the table. Do you want it?
Well, thank you so much, Rob, and thank you all for coming for this lively exchange this afternoon. My task here is to clarify and defend the so-called new natural law theory, NNL for short, on the relationship between natural law and human nature. Now, my aim is to defend NNL on the merits, but I should note that I also take NNL to be more faithful to the basic approach of Aquinas than many so-called traditional natural law theories, TNL for short. Further, although Rob has outlined 6 disputed theses, my response to some of those theses will be to explain why NNL doesn't actually hold them, and to clarify what the NNL view is. In particular, I'll argue that Rob's thesis number 3 is a false characterization of NNL's view of incommensurability, and that all the other theses require at least some clarification. However, I concur with Rob with everything that he says about the agreements between his position and mine, and about the role that natural teleology does play in NNL. And with some clarifications, I also concur regarding the ways in which theoretical knowledge can contribute to practical knowledge. I agree as well with his account of the metaphysics of powers and potentialities until he gets to the point at which he tries to use this metaphysics to define normal for moral purposes, and I'll say more about that a little bit later. But first, let me give a focused account of how natural law relates to human nature on the NNL view, and then offer a broader overview of NNL. In doing so, I'll clarify where NNL differs from Rob's portrayal, and defend the account from the criticisms that remain. Finally, I'll close with a few criticisms of TNL as Rob portrays it. As an aside, I think Rob has made a good faith attempt to interpret NNL correctly, and in general, I find his portrayal more accurate and fair-minded than that of many critics. So first, NNL on natural law and human nature. Now, on this issue, I don't think NNL can be properly understood without attending to a foundational but often overlooked methodological presupposition. That methodological presupposition is drawn from Aquinas' commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, the very first section of that commentary, where he outlines the 4 orders, that is, the 4 ways that reason relates to order, and he uses this to differentiate various fields of knowledge. Here I'm just going to synthesize Aquinas' view for the sake of brevity, but you can see the relevant text on your handout. The first order, which I'll refer to as the metaphysical or physical order, refers to the order that reason can know, but in no way establishes. The second order is the logical order, which reason establishes in its own operations. These first two orders are theoretical or speculative, aimed at knowing for its own sake. The third order, which corresponds to the field of moral philosophy, is the order that reason establishes in the operations of the will. And finally, the fourth order is the order of technique or art, which reason establishes in things external to the intellect and will. These last two orders are practical, aimed at doing good or making well, respectively. Third order knowledge is attained by adopting the first person perspective, that is, the perspective of the deliberating and acting agent. Each of these orders corresponds to one dimension of our complex human nature. But the existence of all the orders, and so of all of these dimensions of our nature, is also a metaphysical truth. All of these points are summarized in the table on the back side of the first page of the handout. Regarding natural law and human nature and the relationship between the first and third orders, NNL affirms the following claims. First, there is normativity and teleology in all of the orders. Second, natural law is metaphysically rooted penultimately in human nature, which encompasses all four orders, and ultimately in God's ordering of all creation. Third, speculative first-order knowledge is prior in some respects to practical knowledge, insofar as first-order knowledge makes us aware of possibilities that we can then grasp through third-order practical reason as good, that is, choice-worthy or to be pursued. Fourth, according to Aquinas' basic methodology, natures are known by their capacities, capacities by their acts, acts by their objects or ends. And so the identification of basic goods reveals human nature to us by revealing the ends or perfections of the various dimensions of human nature in the moral order. Fourth, NNL affirms that speculative knowledge is relevant to ethics in a variety of ways. For instance, theoretical knowledge of human nature, including the knowledge of our ends as organisms, can give us important information about how to promote basic goods. For example, accurate biological knowledge helps us to promote the good of health. But the ends of our nature as organisms do not necessarily correspond to our ends as rational or moral agents, and it's the latter that guide genuine human action. Fifth, and finally, NNL affirms that by reflection on our practical third-order knowledge, we can have speculative first-order knowledge of the existence of the moral order, including its principles and norms, as a metaphysical fact. But, and here's the crux of the difference, I think, between NNL and TNL, NNL holds that you cannot derive moral norms, that is, third-order normativity, from solely first-order normativity. In other words, from a syllogism that contains only first-order premises, you can't derive a third-order conclusion. To derive a third-order, that is, moral conclusion, at least one of the premises must be a third-order premise. But other premises could be supplied by first-order claims. So first-order premises can and do play a crucial role in moral arguments, as should be evident from NNL's arguments about things like marriage or the moral status of human embryos, which Rob helpfully pointed out already. In sum, NNL also affirms natural teleology in the first order and recognizes its relevance to ethics. What it denies is only that one can draw ethical or moral third-order conclusions from solely metaphysical or biological first-order premises. Note that I avoid using the language of facts and values or is and ought here, because this language can be confusing. After all, third-order norms are a kind of fact and can be expressed using is. So NNL's view on this matter comes down to what I just said: no third-order conclusions from solely first-order premises. What I've said so far should already help you to see why Rob's thesis 5 overstates the separation between theoretical and practical modes of knowledge on the NNL account. And also why what his thesis 4 says about the grounding of practical knowledge could be misleading, because the moral order itself has a penultimate metaphysical grounding in human nature and an ultimate metaphysical grounding in God. But to get a fuller picture of the NNL view and respond to the rest of Rob's critiques, let me now zoom out to outline the overall structure of the theory. And for this, you can see the second page of your handout. So NNL has what you might call a two-tiered structure. The first tier is an account of the first principles of practical reason, which are the first principles of natural law. These principles identify and direct us toward basic human goods. These basic human goods are constitutive dimensions of our flourishing and are ultimate or sufficient reasons for action. The second tier of NNL is its account of moral norms, that is, norms that distinguish between morally right and morally wrong actions. The second tier builds on the first because moral norms flow from the integral directiveness of practical reason's first principles, requiring that we be adequately responsive to the rational appeal of every good for every person. So let me say a bit more about each of these tiers in turn. First, basic goods as first principles of practical reason. Genuine human action is action undertaken for the sake of some intelligible end. In the moral order that reason introduces into the will, the end is the good. So, as Aquinas states in question 94, article 2 of the Prima Secundae of the Summa Theologiae, the first principle of practical reason is that good is to be pursued and evil is to be avoided. This most general formulation of the first principle of practical reason, however, needs to be specified by identifying what counts as good. And so the first principles, plural, of practical reason identify and specify the basic goods that are to be pursued, that is, intrinsically choice-worthy. Each of these basic goods is thus a sufficient reason for action that can provide a fully intelligible answer to the question, why are you doing that? Reflection upon our own actions and our judgments about others' actions reveals 7 basic forms or categories of good that provide a sufficient answer to this question, each of which corresponds to and perfects one dimension of our nature. These are life and health, corresponding to our nature as organisms, knowledge and appreciation of beauty, corresponding to our nature as intellectual beings, skillful performance in work and play, corresponding to our nature as unified bodily and rational beings who can develop and coordinate our physical and mental capacities, friendship, corresponding to our nature as social beings, marriage, corresponding to our nature as sexually complementary beings, capable not only of procreation, but of an interpersonal union that encompasses all basic dimensions of the person, mind, heart, and body, and that forms the ideal setting for the generation and education of new human persons, whole new centers of value. Integrity and authenticity, sometimes referred to jointly as practical reasonableness and most perfectly achieved in virtue, corresponding to our nature as complex beings, capable of unifying our feelings, judgments, and actions. And finally, religion, corresponding to our nature as spiritual beings, capable of seeking knowledge of and harmony with the ultimate transcendent source of existence and meaning. I should highlight here that these are categories of good with countless possible instantiations within each category. For instance, there could be knowledge of philosophy or chemistry or Shakespeare and so on and so forth, each of which is itself intrinsically choice-worthy. So despite what Rob said, the list is not really short. In fact, in some sense, it's practically infinite. And Rob's examples of things that supposedly are absent from the list are actually instantiations of one or more forms of good. Now, onto the issue of the incommensurability of basic goods. These basic goods and each of their instantiations provide a distinct, irreducible reason for action, which means that they are incommensurable in basic value, not in all respects, only in basic value. For example, if I choose to study rather than exercise, and even if that choice is fully reasonable, I will lose out on the distinct benefit to health that I might have gained by exercising, and I'll instead get the benefit with regard to the good of knowledge. So in any situation of morally significant choice, there will never be one option that simply provides more benefit than the other options, because there is no such thing as benefit or good in general. Instead, there are distinct types of benefit or good that are irreducible to one another in basic value. If basic goods were not incommensurable in this way, there would be no such thing as free choice. For if there were one option that simply provided more benefit than the others, there would be no reason to choose any other option, and such a choice could be due only to sub-rational factors, ignorance, or error. In other words, if basic goods were not incommensurable in basic value, there would be no moral order, and moral deliberation would be reduced to fourth-order technical reasoning. Now, the first principles of practical reason are normative, but taken individually, they don't provide the criterion for distinguishing between morally right and morally wrong actions, because it's possible to pursue a genuine good, and so to act rationally, following one of the first principles, but to do so in an immoral way. I could, for instance, pursue the good of knowledge by stealing a book. Further, taken individually, these first principles are insufficient to guide action, because there's a reason to act for the benefit of any person with respect to any good. So how do we choose reasonably among goods to pursue and persons to benefit? This guidance for choice is provided by moral norms, second-level reasons that distinguish between morally right and morally wrong actions. And this is what I refer to as the second tier of NNL theory. So what's the basis of these moral norms? Well, like all third-order knowledge, moral norms are based on the first principles of practical reason, which are the first principles in the moral order. These principles direct us to respect and promote human flourishing in its various dimensions. Taken individually, these principles direct us to act for a reason, and thus distinguish rational human action from sub-rationally motivated behavior. Taken as a whole, however, these principles distinguish fully reasonable and thus morally upright action from action that is not fully reasonable, because while it follows one principle, it ignores guidance offered by other principles. In other words, moral norms are based on the integral directiveness of practical reason's first principles. Morally upright actions are fully reasonable, adequately responsive to all of practical reason's first principles. By contrast, immoral actions, while still rational insofar as they correspond to at least one of practical reason's first principles, are not fully reasonable because they fail to respond adequately to all of the principles. And so this leads us to one formulation of NNL's master moral principle, which is choose and act only in ways that are compatible with a will toward integral human fulfillment, that is, the fulfillment of all human persons with respect to all of the basic goods. In less technical terms, morally upright actions respect, and to the extent possible promote, the all-around flourishing of all human beings. In such actions, one's will is open and adequately responsive to every person with respect to every good. And so through such actions, one shapes one's character to be open to enrichment by every form of good, including friendship with every person. By contrast, in immoral actions, one's will is opposed or inadequately responsive to some good or person. And through such actions, One therefore closes oneself to enrichment with respect to that good and or friendship with that person, and so renders oneself unfit for the perfect human community marked out by the ideal of integral human fulfillment. This master moral principle can, in turn, be broken down into a set of intermediate moral norms from which we can then derive more fully specified moral rules. One way of doing this is to consider how one's choices can fail to be compatible with a will toward integral human fulfillment. And I outline on your handout 3 broad ways in which this can occur. 1, the choice could be directly contrary to some good or person. 2, the choice could fail to respond adequately to every person by arbitrarily prioritizing one person's good over another's. Or 3, the choice could fail to respond adequately to the intelligible appeal of every good by arbitrarily prioritizing one good over another. And there are intermediate moral norms directing us to avoid each of these possible failures, also listed on the handout. They are: 1, never intentionally damage or destroy a basic human good; 2, fairness, or the golden rule, which excludes arbitrary prioritization among persons; and 3, the vocation principle, avoid arbitrary prioritization of goods by organizing one's life around a coherent set of vocational commitments and prioritize goods accordingly. Now, I'm only going to elaborate here on the first one, no intentional harm to basic goods, because this is the one that's most controversial. But before doing that, I should note that the second and third norms presuppose that there are reasons to prioritize some people or goods over others. That is, reasons to sacrifice some goods as a side effect of a choice to pursue others. In particular, the vocation principle presupposes that our commitments give us reasons to prefer some people or goods over others. And so these commitments commensurate goods in some respects. Further, moral principles also enable us to identify general hierarchies among goods. For instance, the practical reasonableness most fully realized through virtue and the good of religion play an architectonic or governing role that can and should order and structure all of our pursuits. So as you can see, NNL does not hold either the weak or the strong doctrines of incommensurability that Rob described in number 3. Returning now to the no intentional harm norm, to understand this norm, you have to understand NNL's account of intention. To intend something is to choose it either as an end or as the means by which I seek to achieve my end. This can be illustrated with reference to the idea of a proposal for action. When I make a choice to do something, I assent to a proposal for action that specifies my end and my plan for achieving that end. For instance, earlier this afternoon, it occurred to me that it might be good to get some exercise by going for a walk. I then assented to and executed that plan: get some exercise by going for a walk. My end was to exercise for the sake of health. My chosen means was walking. Now, implicit in that choice of means was my knowledge that walking builds muscle and elevates heart rate, and in so doing helps to benefit my health. And so my proposal, and thus my intention, included my end and all the means that were part of my plan to achieve my end, such as the building of muscle and the elevation of my heart rate. Now, there were, of course, many other effects of walking that I was fully aware of, such as burning calories, wearing down the tread on my shoes, risking injury, and so on. But insofar as these were not part of the proposal that I assented to when choosing to take a walk, insofar as these were neither my end nor the means chosen to achieve my end, these effects were not intended. The reason why intention plays such an important role here, and why it needs to be defined so strictly, is that the point of the moral norm in question is to exclude any willing that is directly contrary to a human good, such that it would render one's will incompatible with a will toward integral human fulfillment. For, as Aquinas emphasizes at the end of the quote on the first page of your handout, human acts, while embodied often in external behaviors, are strictly speaking third-order realities, and are thus specified for the purposes of moral evaluation by the agent's will in choosing to perform them. Foreseen effects of an action that you merely accept, even if you know with certainty that they will occur, do not necessarily render your will incompatible with a will toward integral human fulfillment. They don't necessarily close your will to any person or good. And so such acceptance of foreseen but unintended effects is not forbidden by this moral norm, although it might be wrong for other reasons. This limitation of the prohibition on damage to basic human goods to what one intends, strictly defined, also makes it possible to generate fully specified, exceptionless moral prohibitions. For morality cannot command the impossible, and while it is possible to avoid intending harm to basic goods, it's not possible to avoid all unintended harms, because whatever you choose to do, even if you choose to do nothing, your choice will at least involve accepting harm to the goods that you could have but did not promote. And this is not, by the way, an account of agency that treats it like God's agency, as Rob claims. We don't have absolute power to cause anything to happen, even our own bodily movements, except for our choosing itself. And this is incidentally one of the arguments that NNL theorists make in claiming that even through reason alone, we can and should come to the understanding that every action is potentially part of a cooperative endeavor with God to promote integral human flourishing, because the completion of almost every action requires the cooperation of causes outside of our direct control, causes over which God does have control. And that's also why our choosing itself, that is our acts of will, which include both intending and accepting, is what we are morally responsible for, not the unintended and unforeseen external effects over our actions, over which we do not have direct control. One final response to Rob's criticisms relates to his concern about natural laws not being either natural or law, and it's not taking seriously the importance of political community for human flourishing. I'll say just briefly in response to that, that natural law is both natural and law on the NNL account. We've already seen how it relates to nature. And natural law on the NNL account is also genuine law. It's an ordinance of reason for the common good. The idea of integral human fulfillment is synonymous with the common good of the whole human race. And it's promulgated by a proper authority. The ultimate authority in promulgation are God and his creation of the moral order, respectively. But the immediate promulgation is from practical reason and its principles of the natural law. NNL theorists, especially John Finnis and Robert George, also have very well-developed accounts of the relationship between natural law and human law, and of the need for political community and human positive law to enable us to flourish. They also recognize that some aspects of political community, such as civic friendship and the administration of justice, do have intrinsic value. So that's my overview of NNL with clarifications and responses to Rob's criticisms built in. Now, very briefly, let me close here by presenting some criticisms of the TNL account as Rob presents it. I'll make 3 points here. First, TNL can't actually determine what is normal for the purposes of morality without implicitly importing third-order principles. Second, the alternative to NNL's strict prohibition on intentional damage to basic goods is question-begging, the version of the TNL account. And third, the power activation model of intention is faulty because it fails to recognize what human action essentially is. That's Rob's alternative to what he calls the mental blackboard model of NNL. So first, defining normal. On this point, I'd like to say that Rob's account is more plausible than that of most TNL theorists who try to derive moral conclusions directly and solely from observations about biological teleology. Rob recognizes that the final cause of our bodily organs do not necessarily correspond correctly to the final cause of the whole human person, because the human person is not merely an animal, but a rational animal. And indeed, Rob, following Butler, recognizes that not every biologically rooted tendency is natural in the morally relevant sense. For example, considering human nature from a first-order perspective, human nature would seem to include things like a deep-seated drive toward domination of others. First-order knowledge alone doesn't give us criteria to distinguish between the tendencies that correspond to genuine goods in the moral order and those that don't, like the drive to domination. Now, Rob tries to avoid this problem, relying on Butler, by giving us criteria by which to make this distinction. The criteria he gives are the idea that the good life is characterized by internal coherence and harmony, and second, the good of religion. Now, I don't disagree with these criteria, but I think we recognize the authority of these criteria not on the basis of any first-order observations, but rather because of our practical, third-order grasp of the goods of practical reasonableness and religion, which, as I've already noted, play an architectonic role governing all of our other pursuits. So I don't really disagree with Rob's account of what is normal in the moral sense, but I don't think his conclusions flow from, in his words, simply investigating the human essence and its causal powers. Rather, I think his account actually imports third-order principles to do all of the relevant moral or normative work. Second, regarding exceptionless moral rules. Now, after criticizing the NNL, no intentional harm to basic goods rule, Rob tries to give an alternative grounding for exceptionless moral prohibitions. But I don't think you got to that, Rob. Is that correct? You just mentioned it briefly. So I'll save that because I'm also running out of time, and perhaps we can visit that in the back and forth. And so lastly, let me just go on then to talk about intention on Rob's alternative model. Now, I've already explained the basis for NNL's strict account of intention. And perhaps in the back and forth, we'll talk through some counterexamples which Rob didn't have time to bring up, or supposed counterexamples to the NNL view. But let me now just note that I think Rob's alternative approach to determining what it is that is intended when we act, which relies on the powers that we are choosing to activate when we choose to act, I think that power activation model of intention leads us to very implausible conclusions in what should be easy cases. So, for instance, when I choose to walk to class carrying my backpack, it would seem that the power activation model that Rob proposes implies that I am necessarily intending to do things like exacerbate the soreness of my back muscles or wear out the cartilage in my knees, and so on. Now, it could be that I'm intending some of those things, but it seems utterly implausible to claim that I'm intending all of them or that I'm necessarily intending them, especially if I'm intentionally doing things such as wearing good shoes or carrying as few things as possible to avoid some of these effects. And I think ordinary examples of this sort could be endlessly multiplied. But the deeper problem with the causal powers account is what I said earlier, following Aquinas, namely that human action is not a set of first-order causal relations, but instead human action is a matter of free choice, that is, acts of will ordered to intelligible ends, and therefore it should be defined as such. Thank you.
So I think we'll do the
Okay, great.
Melissa. why don't you come up, and so as to keep the flow until the end, we'll do the rebuttals.
Still do the 5-minute thing.
And I'm going to remove a minute from each of your time since you've already used it. So you have 4 minutes each, which are started right now.
Okay. All right. Good. Well, I'm glad Melissa brought up the 4 orders, because I think that this is Griset's original sin that leads to the misreading of Thomas in lots of other ways, ultimately. If you read that passage carefully, it's clear that this 3rd order is referring to the order that reason introduces into our choices, right? Our choices are always choices of means, not of end, as both Aristotle and Thomas are very explicit. So the order here is simply, the 3rd order is simply the choosing of means to an end. The ends, Thomas is very clear about this, are given to us by nature. So the ends, all the basic human goods, are in the 1st order, not the 3rd order. The 3rd order only concerns the choosing of means to those ends. So it's a fundamental misreading of Thomas based on not having a broad enough set of texts, I think, to look at there. Now, the fundamental problem, substantive problem I have, that's the interpretive problem. The fundamental substantive problem I have is this conflating of metaphysics and epistemology, right? So we agree that we have special inside information as human beings about what the basic goods are for human beings, right? If we're well brought up and we have a good sense of virtue, we acquire a first-person participatory knowledge of our end. I agree with that. And that's our primary and an indispensable means of knowing those ends. But NL thinkers infer from that there's a corresponding metaphysical dichotomy between the ethical facts and the natural ones. And that simply doesn't follow from this epistemological point. In the order of being, our ends are grounded by the constitution of our nature, by the system of powers and potentialities of our species, right? So for the Aristotelian Thomists, there's no metaphysical gap whatsoever between nature on the one hand and reason and morality on the other. We are by nature rational and moral creatures. Now, if there were such a metaphysical dichotomy, that would have further implications for epistemology. It would then mean it was impossible to gain any knowledge of our ultimate ends and of the basic human goods based on scientific knowledge of human nature. But if I'm right, there's no such dichotomy, then it is possible to gain knowledge through empirical anthropology of our basic ends by understanding these powers. Knowledge of a secondary and ancillary kind, presupposing the primary knowledge we get from this first-person perspective, but nonetheless real knowledge. And finally, do I have a couple minutes yet? Yeah, a couple minutes.
A minute and a half.
A minute and a half, okay. So on the incommensurability issue, I don't think I misconstrued it. I think that the new natural law needs a very strong doctrine of incommensurability if they're going to get the no intentional harm principle out of the integral human fulfillment ideal, right? If you don't have that strong incommensurability idea, and if you follow the kind of Butler-Plato model that I presented, there's no reason whatsoever. In fact, it's inconsistent if you were interested in integrated human fulfillment, that you would never violate any particular basic good. If you see that in a particular case, so take ascetical practices. And when I'm fasting, I'm not just giving up eating in order to spend time and resources on other things. I'm deliberately denying myself a particular good, right, in order to readjust my desires. Or in the case of punishment, if I punish a child or if I punish somebody in a criminal setting, we're deliberately depriving them of goods in order to correct their will, in order to restore social harmony. So in fact, unless you have some very, very strong doctrine of incommensurability that says, no, you must never, ever violate one good, no matter what other goods are at stake, unless you have that, then I think this no harm principle just does not follow from the ideal of integrated human fulfillment. In fact, quite the opposite. We should sacrifice in certain cases. So, yeah, okay, 10 seconds. So in the case of intention, right, just war is a good example, right? In the case of just war, we should kill enemy soldiers when it's necessary, right? And we shouldn't pretend that when I blow someone's brains out with a lethal weapon, that I'm not actually intending their death. I'm choosing to use what I know is a lethal means, and I'm applying it. And so there's something really wrong, I think, with the new natural law conception of intentionality that denies that. Okay, great.
Yes. So, thank you, Rob.
Yeah.
So first, I'll just go through the points basically one by one. So first, this question about choices being of means, not of ends.
Yeah.
Now, my understanding of that claim is that we don't determine what our ends are.
Yeah.
Right? So our ends as human beings are given to us.
Yeah.
I am not God determining what it is that fulfills me, right? That's given, I can come to understand it, and I understand it, I think, in the first principles of practical reason.
Right.
However, I do think that we choose among ends, and I think this is probably a genuine difference between our views. So when I'm choosing, and in fact, in any case where there's a genuine choice to be made, there are distinct goods that I'm choosing between. So I'm choosing among goods. I'm not choosing what they are, but I'm choosing among them. And then, of course, I'm also choosing the means to get them. But the choice of means to ends is merely technical. So I think if you want to claim that we do no choosing among ends or among distinct goods, then you reduce genuine moral reasoning to technical reasoning, and I think that's a major problem. It kind of.
But on the interpretive point, I mean, you agree that Thomas explicitly says we don't choose ends, right?
Wait until it's your turn.
All right.
Thank you. Now.
You're another 10 seconds.
Now, on the question about the relationship among the orders and your claim that in the order of being, ends are constituted by our nature, so there should be no kind of dichotomy or separation between metaphysical and moral orders. I think there's a bit of an ambiguity here in the way in which the term nature is being used, because all of the orders are part of human nature. So the question is, which aspect of human nature, or which mode of knowing human nature, is the mode that is relevant directly and immediately to ethics? And my claim is that it's knowledge in the third order that has that direct and immediate relevance to ethics. And the problem with saying that first order knowledge has that immediate relevance, again, I think it can have all sorts of indirect, immediate relevance, but immediately I don't think it maps directly onto our goods because of things like I said about, empirically you can look around and say human beings appear to have a deep-seated drive toward aggression or domination or things like that. Those clearly don't correspond to goods. But empirically, they are statistically quite common, and they may even have evolutionary kind of biological reasons that are the biological purpose for those drives. And so that's why I think you have to use third-order criteria to differentiate which of those drives that we can observe from the outside in a kind of theoretical first-order way, which of those correspond to genuine human goods and which do not. And then lastly, on this point about intention and the no intentional harm to basic goods rule, I don't think that your counterexamples are real counterexamples. So you bring up fasting or punishing a child. So I think in those cases, what you are doing is denying yourself pleasure or causing pain intentionally. And I don't think that there are any problems with that, because pleasure and pain, while connected to various human goods, which gives us a reason to like pleasure and avoid pain in general, they are not themselves intelligible goods. They are sensible goods. And so I don't think there's any moral prohibition on denying pleasure or causing pain if there is a good reason for that. And so I would ask you in response, really, is how, on your view, do you get exceptionless norms? So it's clear how it comes from the new natural law perspective, but I'm not clear on how you can get exceptionless moral norms without something like the no intentional harm rule.
So I think what we'll have to do at this point is 3-3 and then close things off.
Yeah, or we could just go, I mean, maybe we should go to the discussion. Do we need another statement?
That's fine, I don't need another statement.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Well, quick question while hands are raised. Means ends seems like a nice dichotomy, but often aren't we selecting and choosing things we might call sub-ends?
What do you mean by that?
Well, we often don't pick the thing that's actually the telos, but we pick things on the way, either proleptically or actually as a known
There's a whole
step,
chain
on
of
the way.
means.
There's a chain,
Yeah,
yeah.
So are those means or ends?
Well, those would be both, obviously. But when Thomas says we don't choose the end, he means the ultimate end. We don't choose the ultimate end.
We don't, meaning we don't offer it up. It's offered. It's given to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's our natures direct us to our final cause, which is eudaimonia, right? And we don't choose that. We have no choice over that. So the domain of choice is the domain of choosing actions and means toward that end.
Right, but the ultimate end is something that, in fact, I mean, you really can't choose. You can choose in accord with it.
Yeah.
By choosing genuine goods in a morally upright manner.
Right.
But
that's
you
why
actually
they're not,
can't choose it.
That's
so,
why they're not
yes.
part of the third order. That's why they're part of the first order. Because the only things that you can choose
But
are
you
part
can
of the
choose
third
in
order.
accord with it.
Yeah,
And
but that's not what he
third order.
says. He says explicitly that the third order is an order that reason imposes by choosing. By choosing means for ends. And so it's saying that when I choose, like when we choose to exercise to get healthier, that's not a natural process. That's a rational process, right, that our reason is imposing. But that doesn't mean that the good of health itself is something that the reason creates in that way. That's,
right,
that already belongs in the first order. That's just part of what it is to be human, to have that as your
But
end.
I don't understand why you say what it is to be human and then say first order. What it is to be human is all the orders. And in fact,
well, no.
the third order is more distinctively human.
No,
because the first order is an aspect of humanity that we share with non-human creatures.
That's probably right. That's probably right. I mean, ultimately, everything's part of the first order. So that's why you can't exclude the first order. And I think you're still, frankly, not distinguishing epistemology and metaphysics carefully enough. So I agree that you can't just do metaphysics or empirical anthropology if you're a bastard, right? You don't have any apprehension of the human good. This is what Aristotle says, right? If you're not well brought up, don't do ethics. You're not going to be able to do it well. I totally agree with that. But that doesn't mean then that you can't discover things that are directly relevant to the human good in empirical science if you are well brought up and understand the science properly.
So we saw a question there. We can't see you very well. Can you stand, identify yourself, and ask your question? It's one of you there. Either one.
Thanks for this really splendid debate. Thank you very much. So both.
This is Dominic Burbage of the Canterbury
Thank you.
Institute.
Canterbury Institute and lecturer of politics here at Oxford. So neither of you have sort of talked or depended much on ideas of virtue in your accounts. And it strikes me as nevertheless relevant, especially for questions of whether a first-person agent perspective yields insights on the basic goods, the extent to which their understandings are communicable to others for forming standards of behavior or a general appreciation of the natural law. So I was wondering if you would give some idea of your sense with which virtue is placed within your accounts, and whether this might help us with distinctions between theoretical and practical reason. I sometimes feel that post-Enlightenment, both accounts, the traditional, the new, have been articulated in ways that makes discovery of the good quite a scientific enterprise, especially with respect to theoretical reason. But if we take seriously that, the pure in heart can see God, in a way, living the life of virtue seems to nevertheless have some holding on theoretical and abstract truths. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's take the question just behind yours and then have answers and conclude.
Mine was more on the relationship between the two, but not the knowledge, but just with the new natural law theory, the way you're describing it, could you have the same facts about human powers, the same human essence, everything the same, and yet different basic goods? Or is there a necessary connection between these basic goods and the nature with the essence and the different powers? Do you see? Because then you would, I think, agree at least on that there's some sort of necessary connection between the two.
So
Thomas Osborne, I'm sorry.
Two good questions.
I'm
We'll
Tom
give you
Osborne.
each time to answer this, and we'll be done within 5 minutes. For those of you who want to then go on to the sung evensong, you'll go to the chapel, the lights of which will be turned on. For those who want to continue conversation, please go down the cloisters to the Ursel room that's on your left. But as soon as we're done, we'll have to empty this part of the chapel.
So a quick answer to the second question is yes. That if human nature were different, our goods would be different. But I think the argument of NNL, and I don't know the extent to which Rob disagrees with this, is that we identify the ends of our nature precisely from the practical first order perspective.
For the most part.
Now, on the question about virtue, there's a lot that can be said about this, and I think that Griset's articulation of the moral norms of the New Natural Law account give more attention to virtue because Griset parses moral norms by thinking about the ways in which sub-rational inclinations or motions can fetter the directiveness of our practical reason, right? And so this is, I think, very easy to recognize just from reflection about why is it that we often do wrong things, right? It's, there's laziness, there's pride, there's all sorts of stuff, there's fear, right? All sorts of emotions that can get in the way, or desire for pleasure, that can get in the way of doing what we recognize that we ought to do, and that can block our reasoning, and so prevent us from thinking things through properly in order to do what is right. So they can block our ability to recognize the right thing to do. They can also block our willingness to do the thing that we judge to be the right thing to do. At the level of very first principles, that is identification of basic goods, in theory, anybody should have access to those as long as you've had some experience of them, even vicarious experience of them. But even there, Aquinas says that we can be blocked in our apprehension of them by a bad upbringing, by vices, by a corrupt culture. And so you can think of this in ways that bias, for instance, or the fact that dominant cultural views are against it can lead to a failure to correctly apprehend or appreciate some basic goods. Even though I think in practice, we do recognize and act for basic goods, even if we don't always admit it. So it's almost like the principle of non-contradiction. You can have some philosophers who will try to argue against it, but doing so is performatively inconsistent because in arguing against it, they're presuming that the opposite can't also be true. And so they're presuming the truth of the very principle that they're denying.
Would you like to say something? We have about a minute.
No, I think that makes sense. I mean, I agree with what I think she said. Melissa said. I did have one quick question. Can virtues in general count as basic goods in the natural law?
So the basic
Like
good
courage
that's
or
sometimes
justice?
referred to as integrity or other times as practical reasonableness, if you consider that from the perspective of the integral directiveness of practical reason, in other words, from the second tier perspective, that good is virtue. The reason why it's articulated not as virtue but as integrity or practical reasonableness at the level of the first tier is that any of the basic goods can be sought immorally. And I think anytime we say do something just for pleasure, we are seeking a kind of illusory version of the good of integrity. Because there's an inner tension whenever you feel like doing something but can't. And one way to relieve that tension is to give in, right? Now that's illusory insofar as in the long run, that leads to a disharmony between reason and passion because it subordinates passion to reason. And so that's not a morally good way of seeking that good, but that is the way we rationalize pure pursuit of pleasure. And so that's why I say from the moral perspective, the way to achieve the good of integrity is by growing in virtue.
So I've been told by the sacristan that we may be able to win a few more minutes to take a couple more questions, as long as everyone's very well behaved just before Evensong starts. So why don't we take two more questions? Nathan, and is there one more out there? Yes, okay, so what's your name, sir? What's your name, sir, sorry?
concerning supreme ends and means, actually, because I will address this issue concerning Hobbes and Locke in particular on Friday when I will give my presentation. But even when I think of Aquinas and Locke in particular, any philosopher...
Can you speak slightly more slowly, please?
Okay. Any philosopher who has supposed the existence of a supreme end has also given one particular means to achieve it. So I'm thinking, for instance, of Locke. He says the supreme end is eternal beatitude, and therefore we should respect the divine moral law and, repent for sin and have faith. I'm thinking of Aquinas himself. I mean, in Summa Contra Gentiles, he says, the supreme end, of course, is eternal happiness, and the source of happiness is not in carnal pleasures, worldly power, or honors, for instance, but it's in the exercise of the highest powers that God has given to us, rational powers, and the perfection of the intellect and knowledge. Even Hobbes was not, he was an atheist, he was not a believer. He maintained that the supreme end is the preservation of our life, and he gave the laws of nature in order to lead us to preserve our life in this world. So I'm thinking, in the moment when a philosopher proposes a supreme end, is it really true that we have different means to pursue the supreme end, or in fact, don't we have actually one means only in order to achieve that particular end, be it eternal beatitude or self-preservation in this life? Thanks.
Thank you. We'll take Nathan's question and then have responses from the speakers, and if you want to begin, Rob, the responses.
Hi, Nathan Helms, the Pharos Institute.
Close.
Oh, okay. You guys were sort of on the cusp of getting into this disagreement about the fasting example and whether that's merely in the infliction of pain or the denial of pleasure, or whether there was something more substantive going on and something more substantive being sacrificed. And then, we sort of ran out of time. But if there's another few minutes, I'd like to hear the end of that. That sounded interesting.
Thank you.
I didn't catch what he said at the very end.
He wants you to disambiguate pleasure from other things.
Oh, right. Yeah, so I'm inclined to agree that pleasure is not in itself a good thing, right? It's a kind of, maybe it's an indication of something good, or it's the sort of a byproduct of doing an activity that's intrinsically... Yeah, that's what Aristotle says, right? It supervenes on the good activity. And so when we pursue pleasure, like illicitly, like in the cocaine or something like that, it's not a real pleasure in a sense. There's something illusory about the pleasure, right? You're getting the sensation as if you were doing some really cool activity and you're not doing anything much, right? So yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a common ground here, is that we're not really, we have no truck with any kind of hedonism, right? on either point. Is that sort of roughly on your, or did I miss something? No. Fasting, yeah, right. So I think fasting. It seems to me that it's not just masochism, right? I'm not just imposing pain on myself. I'm depriving myself of a particular good, right, to which I'm excessively attached. Or I could fast from a friendship or something. I'm
not do cocaine.
Yeah, but something that's generally good. And I'm not just not spending as much time with my friend because I'm doing other things. I'm intentionally not talking to that friend for this week because I know that I've become too attached to that friendship and I need to. So I think it is directly acting against the good for the sake of the overall good of my constitution. And likewise, punishment. Oftentimes I punish my child not by causing them pain necessarily, but by depriving them of some good. So they want to spend some time with their friends, or they want to enjoy some kind of good, go to the park, something like that. No, you can't. So it's intentionally depriving them of a good for the sake of something better, for the sake of the overall constitution. So,
on that question, I think punishment is legitimate when it is deprivation of non-basic goods. So if you think of the typical ways of punishing people, you imprison them, you take away freedom. Now, freedom is a condition.
It's not a basic good?
But it's not a basic good.
There's where your list gets too short because you have these weird constraints.
No, so freedom, but one of the reasons why it's not a basic good is that freedom can be used badly, right? So freedom is good if it's directed toward good ends, but bad in a sense. So freedom is an anthropological condition for any action, the pursuit of any good. But freedom, particularly if you think about freedom at the level of physical freedom, is merely instrumental to being able to pursue goods, right? If you're restricted physically in your freedom, as in being in prison, there are a lot of goods that you are incapable of pursuing. But by imprisoning somebody, we're not intending their inability to pursue goods directly. What we are intending is to restrict their freedom so as to restore the balance of justice. Because what does somebody do when they say, for instance, break the law? Well, what they do is they use freedom that other people, the law-abiding, have restrained themselves from using, right? The law limits our freedom in a variety of ways. And so to be fair, everybody has to accept being limited in all of those ways. And the criminal says, well, I'm going to take freedom that is deprived, that others are being deprived of. And so there's a kind of imbalance there where that person has taken freedom that others have denied themselves for the sake of the common good. And so we rectify that balance through a punishment like imprisonment, where we take away that freedom, or a fine, similarly, right? Taking away money is a kind of proxy for taking away freedom. The infliction of pain on a different level, right, is a non-basic good, again, because pleasure and pain are sensible good, so that's another means of punishment.
So freedom of physical motion is a basic good, I think. So that's just